here we have the problem. Here from the Washington Post on May 24th, so just a few days ago, is an article that reads, quote, that is headlined, "The Deepening Radicalization of Donald J. Trump. Watch how the former president's positions and rhetoric have grown more confrontational and extreme as he seeks a second term." So if Donald Trump in 2016 was Adolf Hitler, and Donald Trump is now worse and more radical and more extreme than he was even back in 2016, that must necessarily mean he's now evolved to be worse than Hitler, or that Hitler is better than Donald Trump. So Hitler's kind of rising on the chart through history, rising in the rankings by virtue of this attempt to constantly assert that all sorts of people, as we're going to show you, are worse than Hitler. It's an extremely dangerous rhetorical device, an extremely dangerous historical framework to constantly impose. And obviously 4 years from now in 2028, when there's other Republican candidates, or maybe it'll be Ron DeSantis, they're going to have to keep going and going and going because that's what they always do. We're going to get to the point where we're going to hear that half the Republican Party or half the country is worse than Hitler. That, again, conversely, Hitler is up here in terms of moral weight and ethical constraints, and Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, Vladimir Putin, and tons of other people who are on the target list of the liberal media is down here. The Washington Post article to support that claim reads, quote, "On this and a host of subjects, from sexual assault to foreign and domestic policy, Trump's positions have become even more extreme. His tone more confrontational, his accounts less tethered to a reality, according to a Washington Post review of Trump's speeches and interviews with former aides. When he was at times ambiguous or equivocal, he's now brazenly defiant." Now, in addition to claiming that Trump is worse than before when he was equated to Adolf Hitler, we also have the increasingly common theme that Ron DeSantis is even worse than, and specifically more dangerous than, Donald Trump. In other words, Ron DeSantis is worse than and more dangerous than Adolf Hitler. It's necessarily the logical implication of this assertion. And again, you see it all over the media. Here from the Huffington Post, just from last week, no one is more dangerous for the White House than Ron DeSantis, including Donald Trump. Quote, "Imagine Trump, but with a stalwart dedication to legislation that moves the country in a direction that should terrify most reasonable human beings. Enter Florida Governor Ron DeSantis." Which legislation that Ron DeSantis has advocated or has overseen the implementation of is comparable to Nazism or what Adolf Hitler did, and that should terrify citizens everywhere? I understand that people disagree with some of Ron DeSantis' legislation. That's reasonable. There are culture war debates that the country is split on, and he's on one side, and of course other people would be on the other. That's commonplace. That's true of Democratic Party candidates as well. But to say that he's more dangerous and he's terrifying, what is the basis for that? The NAACP issued an advisory warning for non-white people for Florida. That's how much they're trifling with these concepts. I'm not even going to make an argument for why that's preposterous. Huge numbers of black voters and Latino voters voted for Ron DeSantis twice for governor. And yet the NAACP, again, a group of East Coast elites who have very little in common with the black working class or other non-white members of the working class who purport to speak on them nonetheless, on their behalf nonetheless, are issuing statements that bear no resemblance to reality, and in the process of doing so are completely really harming themselves. They're watering down and rendering laughable concepts that actually ought to be taken seriously. Here from MSNBC, April 2022. And again, they read from the same script, so these are just a small sampling. The headline there, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is a far more dangerous politician than Donald Trump. Like Trump, DeSantis' time in office would be marked by attempts to pit Americans against one another. But unlike Trump, DeSantis has the proven ability to follow through. Pit Americans against one another? Hillary Clinton in 2016 said that a large chunk of Trump supporters, namely 25 or 30 or 35% of the country, were irredeemably deplorable. Irredeemably deplorable. It is the official position of the Democratic Party that anyone who doesn't vote for them is racist and fascist and white supremacist. Joe Biden famously or notoriously told the host of the Breakfast Club, Charlemagne, that if he had any questions at all about whether he wanted to vote for Joe Biden, that meant that Charlemagne isn't even black. Pitting the country against one another, if that's enough to make you a terrifying Hitler-esque figure, which politicians don't do that? Here is from this MSNBC article, quote, Ron DeSantis is the governor of Florida, a front runner for the Republican presidential nomination, and quite possibly the most dangerous figure in American politics. The most dangerous figure in American politics. While it's hard to imagine any politician wrestling that title away from Donald Trump, and yes, it should be hard to imagine any politician wrestling that title away from Donald Trump, since we spent 6 years, as I just showed you, hearing that Trump is the new Hitler. DeSantis manages. He brings something to the table that Trump lacks. His ability to translate political vindictiveness, cruelty, and demagoguery into policy results. Now, it isn't only Ron DeSantis and Trump's current iteration in 2024 that are said to be worse than the Hitlerian version of Trump in 2016. As I indicated, that also became a tactic used by lots of liberal elites to try and claim that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was like anything we've seen, including during World War II, was somehow vastly more dangerous than the Nazi march through Western Europe. And in order to do that, they actually started explicitly praising Adolf Hitler, which is where all of this leads. Here is Michael McFaul, the former ambassador to Russia for the United States under President Obama, who's now become one of the most deranged and hawkish pro-war voices when it comes to Ukraine. He was on Rachel Maddow's show, and listen to what he said as he tried to claim that Putin is worse than Hitler, and in doing so actually went out of his way to praise Hitler for having some constraints that Putin lacks.
One of the Russian journalists said, there's one difference between Hitler when he was coming in and Putin. Hitler didn't kill ethnic Germans. He didn't kill German-speaking people. That's I think people need to remember that when we're talking about cities like Kharkiv and Mariupol and Kiev, there are large populations there, up to a third and sometimes as much to a half that are Russian speakers and are ethnic Russians. And yet Putin doesn't seem to care about that. He slaughters the very people he said he has come to liberate.
First of all, it wasn't even true. Of course, there were German-speaking or ethnic German who died as a result of Hitler's advance through Czechoslovakia and through Poland and through other parts of Western Europe. But even if it were true, what moral relevance does that have? And how do you not have an instinctive aversion to going out of your way to praise Hitler or to suggest that Hitler somehow had ethical constraints that Vladimir Putin lacks? Again, whatever you think of the invasion of Ukraine, it's far more comparable to the U.S. invasion of Iraq than it is to anything that made Hitler Hitler during World War II. And in fact, I would say that, and I've made this argument before, that there's a big, big difference between sending your troops into a neighboring country over the border that is the most sensitive part of your border, that the West has been very actively engaged in running and manipulating and putting weapons into and flooding with lethal arms, then packing up your entire military and going to the other part of the world, all the way across the other part of the world, to invade and occupy and destroy a country that has never once threatened to attack you, let alone had the ability to do so. I've said from the very beginning that I believe Russia's war and invasion of Ukraine is not legally or morally justified. And I had Norman Finkelstein on my show who yelled at me for that, saying the logical conclusion of observing that there were provocative acts by the West going all the way up to the Russian border with all sorts of interference on the part of the US and NATO necessarily justifies the invasion. And anyone like me or Aaron Mate or others who's afraid to say that and who still maintains that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is unjustifiable as either being a coward or morally inconsistent. That's what Norman Finkelstein told me. I think you heard that argument. But I do actually believe that the Russian invasion was unjustified. I don't think the conditions were met ethically or legally to justify military invasion of a sovereign country like this. But it is far more like what the Americans did and the British and the Australians did in Iraq than it is to anything that Adolf Hitler did. And yet you have these voices so casually going out of their way to downplay Hitler's evil in order to take whoever they want to villainize and make them worse than Hitler. It is a deranged discourse. It's an ahistorical discourse, and it's a very dangerous discourse because these are the people who really do believe that they are empowered now to do anything and everything because of the nature of the enemy that they're fighting. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.